And mixed in with that, they go into the protocol suites. Talking about the TCP/IP protocol suite and standards, and then the reference models, and a little bit more towards the end on encapsulation and such. And they've combined some stuff they used to do in separate chapters on this. So, any event, with the protocols, that they talk about those first, and they tend to spend a good bit of time here in this chapter on the protocols. Previous books, they actually had that sort of scattered out separately, and then the reference models, that they had that really scattered more into a full chapter before, so they sort of condensed the reference models and standard organizations down some. But they talk first about protocols and establish those to you. And the protocols, as they've got labeled there on page 93 to you, that they said the rules. And that's really what protocols are. And that you've got a lot of different protocols out there, and that they're your rules for communications between the devices. And so you've got different ways of communicating on it, and that they do, and that you've got tons of protocols running out there. And that's where you'll really get into that alphabet soup situation. So that the protocol is just a rule for how's it communicating one device with the other. Humans are using protocols out there actually also, not just in terms of communications, but you'll see it more in terms of just how we interact. There's certain protocols of how interaction occurs between humans, which is really what it comes back to here in computers, is how are the two machines interacting with each other. And so there's protocol out there that you don't always know it was protocol you were doing. You may not have known of it as that, but that there's rules out there that we operate by that aren't always laws. If we're walking down the hall and there's a number of people in the hall, where do you all walk in the hall? On the right side of the hall, correct? That we tend to stay over there. There's not a law that says you walk on the right side of the hall, as opposed to when you're out there on the highway driving. The law says you're going to drive on the right side of the road, correct? But just walking around, there's a protocol on that. So that's a protocol. There's other more formal protocols that, like on governments dealing with governments, that they have specific protocols that they go by. And so like a diplomat being assigned to a new country, that their protocol says when they get to that new country, they're supposed to report to the leader of that country to present themselves as the diplomat from the other country, and to present the paper showing they're the official representative there. Protocol also says about how, when you meet certain people, how you react to them. And so, and there's much less of it in America than it is in other countries. That if you go to like the British, that there's rules of how, when, depending on what level of person you are you supposed to bow when you meet another person, or you shake their hand, or what? That if you go and meet the Queen of England, if you were a British subject as a male, you're supposed to bow to her. But as a non-British subject, you're not supposed to bow, and you're not supposed to shake her hand. And you'll see things in the paper ever so often in the news about people or whatever violating those protocols, and people getting all upset about it. And so there's less of that in some cases than it used to be. But there is certain expectations of rules, and there used to be a whole lot more to it, that certain things happened, you were supposed to do certain things, and that if you went to certain events, you were supposed to always send a thank you note for it. And now a lot of those have varied out. But it is the rules there of how does communication occur. The other part is that sort of the languages will fall into that one too. That if we're going to talk back and forth with each other, whichever language I'm going to talk in, it's got to be a language you understand. That if I start talking in Spanish up here and none of y'all understand Spanish, we're not going to have very good communications, right? And that even sometimes if I'm talking in English up here and that you all understand English, that there's times that you may go, wait a minute, I don't understand whoever it is talking to me, and because of how their English is, that it's difficult to understand. And that we've all run into people out there that listening to them and that they were talking English, but we just couldn't understand it.
Did you get logged in?
No. It started it. I can get on in the office.
Yeah.
Oops.
I think it's a problem with the school's internet, maybe.
Okay, now it's letting me in. Did you reset something?
I didn't do anything. I just
Okay.
thought I'd come up here and check it.
Our computers aren't working.
None of them?
We don't have internet access at all.
We can do like Google, but once we actually click on a website, it don't work. Mine's signed out, but it's showing it.
Because it was not letting me in a few minutes ago, and I walked down to the office and logged right back in there where I'd been in all morning, and that's when I sent you the email.
Well, it just sounded kind of strange.
And last week it would let me log in, but wouldn't let me log in to Blackboard in any way when I'd try.
Yeah.
And then it was, so it's been peculiar. But this morning it just would not let me, it was telling me my account was locked out, and I'm going, there is no way my account is locked out when I'm getting in the office and been in it all morning.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's letting me on into Blackboard now. And it will let me in GNet here now. All right, now.
I wonder if it's DNS.
Hmm?
Sorry.
That's what it was popping up when I was looking stuff up
So is it blocking them on getting to stuff?
earlier. Yeah.
I think it's a DNS issue because I can ping 8.8.8.8. All right. get with Ted and see if there's something going on with the network.
But I sent that message that you got, well, sent to Ted too, so.
Yeah, I saw that you CC'd him on it.
So who knows if he set something on me in the meantime too, while you came to check.
Yeah, Ted may have reached that something.
Because I was sending to both of y'all since.
Well, now at this point, it's the whole IT department.
All right, so now they talk about when you're sending the messages, they talk about that there's a source, a destination, and a channel. And that those are the elements of the communication. So the source is, where's it coming from? The destination's where is it going to? Okay? And then the channel is how's it getting there? What media is it traveling across to get to the other location? And then they talk about on the protocols on that. So in the midst of doing those three things, that you've got a source, a destination, and a channel, that you've got to have a common way for those two to talk to each other. And y'all think about all the different type machines we've got out there, and that the operating systems and everything, that there's got to be a commonality between them. And that if you don't have that commonality there, they're not going to be able to talk back and forth with each other. Which actually, if you go back to the 80s and before, basically that's where you were at when you first went to looking at to networking. What were we going to do to be able to get them when we started wanting to have machines talk to each other? How were we going to do that? And the protocols are going to do that because the different machines all communicated with them within the machine differently. So that Windows, how its stuff is set up, is different than what iOS on the Mac has, which is different than Linux or Unix. And so those were there. So the part is to establish that they had common protocols on it. And initially when you started doing networking, the different companies set up their own totally different networks and they couldn't talk with each other. Does that make sense? So we could set up a network here that was all Windows machines, and all of the Windows machines could talk to each other here in the school. But we couldn't talk to another network that was a different one than Windows. That if they had Apple machines there, the networks couldn't talk with each other. Or if we tried to put an Apple machine onto that Windows network, it didn't work because it didn't know how to talk with the others. So everybody follow on that part? So you had to develop some common protocols on it. And that the protocols have to be the ability that they identify who's sending it and who's getting it. That's got to be built into there in the protocol. And that there's got to have that common language there. That they're both using, each of the machines is using that same protocol. And then speed and timing of delivery is important there too. Because they've got to both be operating at the same speed or have the ability to operate at the same speed. So if one machine's a whole lot faster than the other, that one that's a whole lot faster has got to have the ability to slow down to send the stuff to the other one. And then they also have to have a confirmation or acknowledgement requirement. And some protocols, when you're using them, will have that acknowledgement or confirmation, and some will not. As we go along, we'll see. So you're going to send some stuff out there that there's no acknowledgement. You trust it got there. And there's other stuff that you send that you make sure it did get there. And to do it in real life, think about your communications out there. If we do a phone call and talk to each other, we know the other person heard whatever it was we were telling them. Everybody follow on that? So that if you're talking to the other person, they're going to confirm back they heard what you just told them. But think about TV. They send out information all the time. But does the TV station really know anybody ever got the information? No. They're going to have to do some third-party method to determine it was received, but there's a trust that it's being received by people when they put it out there. That radio station or TV station just sending it out there for everybody, and there's a trust that it actually arrives. Okay? So it's not confirmed, and they have no way of knowing for sure that it really did arrive. So then talk about encoding, and what encoding is that is where we convert the information we want to send, or the data, into a form that's acceptable for whatever the media is that we're using for that channel. So that's just converting it into a method that it understands it and where it can send it across, and that it's got to be encoded. It's got to be put into however that media can handle it. And so it will be encoded on that. And then the other end is going to hear it and decode it back into how they work with it to get it out of that. You're going to format your message, and when you format it, they talk here in terms of frames, which is one of the type things you're going to use right there, because we're going to really have more than frames, but they're going to mention frames at this point, because we're going to see later that we've got packets out there also. But the frame is when we're really getting down to just sending it across. We're really getting close to the level where we actually send it across on the channel. So the frame is going to have on it, where is it going? What machine is it going to? What's that source? It's going to have where did it come from, and actually on the frame actually has first normally on it where it came from, and then where's it going to. Sort of like when you send a letter. What do you do on the letter? You've written on there the whole address of where you're sending it to, and you should have a return address on it also, right? Now, agreed, a lot of times a lot of people don't put return addresses on things. But if you don't put the return address, if it's unable to get to the destination, they can't send it back to you for you know it never got to the destination, okay? The other part is when the person gets it, if you've got the return address on there, they can tell right off where did it come from. And then you're going to have the actual message in there, but before the message comes in there, you usually have a marker that says, here's the beginning of the message. Actually, you'll have, in a lot of cases, instead of a beginning marker at that point, in a lot of cases on frames, the beginning marker comes before the whole frame, and then at the end, that it's not just marking the message itself, but it's the entire frame is marked. And then you'll have the actual data in there. Now, when you put that message inside this frame, you're encapsulating it, because you're putting it inside something else. Because you had a message you're going to send, but you're actually putting it inside something to send it. Okay? Back to that example of the envelope through the postal service. You've got a card or a letter enclosed in that envelope, which is what you were really sending to the person, right? But to get it to them, you had to put it inside an envelope for it to go through the postal service. Or you'd have to go just hand it to them. That if you wanted to send it through the postal service, you've got to encapsulate that message inside that envelope where it's got all the addressing on it. But the message basically isn't on the outside of that. So you've got that there. As part of when you're sending that message, putting that message in there, you are also limited when you're sending it through on your channel to a certain size. So depending on what you're wanting to send, it may have to be broken into smaller components, that the message size may be limited, because there's a maximum size of messages that can be sent through your network. Likewise, if you want to send packages through the Postal Service, there's a maximum size of how big of a package you can send through the post office or through UPS or FedEx. But they all limit you on sizes of things you're sending. UPS and FedEx are going to take bigger things than the post office, but there's a limit to how big of a package the post office will let you send. If it's something bigger than that, you can still send it through the post office, but what do you have to do? Break it down into smaller pieces, right? So you're going to disassemble it, whatever it is you're sending. And sometimes that doesn't really work, so you can't send it that way. Okay? But a lot of times you can. Well, if you're going to disassemble it, you're going to label all the parts when you disassemble it and send it to them, so that when they get it at the other end, they get all of the packages that you just sent to them. They can put it all back together and they've got the same thing you had before you sent it to them, right? Does everybody follow on that? And that you've labeled each of those so they can do that. Likewise, when you're sending stuff across the network, and this is stuff happening behind the scenes that the person sending it's not doing, and that y'all don't see when you go to send it, that if it's bigger than what that network allows it to be sent, it has to break that message into smaller parts, which is what happens quite often. Okay? Now, if you stream it across, you're really not breaking it into the smaller parts, that it's getting sent continuously as one bit after another bit on it. But otherwise, it's getting broken apart. And you'll sometimes see delay or how things all of a sudden go to display to you that it does a little weird on, okay? And then some things you send that it has to come in a certain order and that you put a requirement on that. So different systems are going to have different message sizes, so different type networks. Now, when you're connecting all these different type networks together, what that means is you may start off when it sends, it may be a big message that was sendable within your network. But then in the process of getting to the network where it's going, it may hit a spot where the next network doesn't take messages that big, that it's not able to handle that big of messages. Then at that point it will proceed to break it up into smaller parts and send on in multiple frames what it was sending split up. Everybody follow on that? It's just like when you're out there driving on the road, that there can be places you can get to on the road that roads get narrower or whatever, and that you can't drive whatever vehicle it is on down that road. And that then things have to be figured out, how do we get it there? And that you may have to split the item up or whatever on the truck and put it into cars or pickup trucks or whatever to take on down the road, because you can't take that big truck down that road. They throw you a couple of definitions right here. They mention about the acknowledgments right here, which is what I had said a moment ago, that some messages you send, you have to get an acknowledgement back. Some messages do not have an acknowledgement on them, that it's sent out and there's a trust that it's received. And the assumption is, if it's not received, that the recipient will send a request for it to be sent again. In other cases, there's a mandatory part on it that the sender has to get an acknowledgement back or they won't send the rest of the stuff. And that we'll look at some protocols later. When we look at FTP, File Transfer Protocol, we'll see that on it, as you go to send that file across using FTP, there's a continuous response back, and it won't send the next part of it till it knows the previous part was already received. But then they talk about a couple of different types of transmissions here that they throw in real briefly to you, and that's unicast, multicast, and broadcast, which is 3 different ways you can send your messages across. And that messages get sent these 3 ways all the time. Unicast is what you probably have thought mostly about on network sending. It's where you're sending a message from one machine to another machine. And you're sending it from one specific machine to another machine. Because when y'all sit there and you send a request to Google, you're sending a unicast message. You're sending from their machine to the Google server. Does everybody follow on that? Or if you send an email, you're sending it to one other person. That's a unicast transmission. It's a one-to-one transmission. You're sending from one machine to one machine. A broadcast transmission is where you're sending something out and it's sent to a number of machines. And actually in email, you'll see yourself sometimes send a unicast email and sometimes a broadcast email. So that here at the college, within the faculty, that we can send an email to just one person on the faculty or just a couple, and it goes one-to-one to each of those. Or we can send it to the entire faculty, all employees of the college, that there's a address we send to for that, and it sends them to them all.
I thought like the multicast would be for multiple people, and then the broadcast for the
Yeah.
entire.
So that we're doing a multicast in terms of that, okay? Broadcast says we're sending it to everybody, okay? So therefore I'm sending it to all of GNTC, I'm broadcasting it.
Yeah, intercast, me and you, I'm sending just to you. Multicast if I send it to everyone in the classroom. And broadcast would be the entire campus.
Essentially. But unicast is where we're sending it one-to-one. Broadcast is where we send it to everybody. And actually back in the original days of the internet, you could actually broadcast a message on the internet that went to everybody that was on the internet. There were firewalls, etc., sort of block you on doing that one anymore, because that was abused after a while. And people still try to abuse on that one. And then multicast says we're sending it to more than one, but to a group. Okay? The advantage on multicast, and you could send unicast to a number of people, and where you're sending a separate copy of the message to each one. So everybody follow on that? You're sending the same message to several different people, or from one machine to another machine, but you're sending the same one multiple copies. So you've got multiple copies traveling across your network. So if you're sending to 5 people, you got 5 copies of that message going. If you multicast it to those 5 people, you're only sending one message that goes to 5 different addresses. So everybody see the difference between those two? Your network's not going to get bogged down by the second one as opposed to the first one. Okay? Because it's only sending one to multiple ones. And then if it's going to go to everybody, it's a broadcast. Now, as far as individual sending, you're really not doing much of the broadcast. However, protocols are sitting there continuously sending messages to all of the other computers on their network within there and will broadcast out messages to everybody, to all of the other machines. But individuals aren't so much of doing that one, okay? But it's the machines talking to machines that you'll see the broadcast most often on. And then the multicast, you'll see that sometimes in terms of a lot of other type things, and actually when it some of the cases of where you're doing streaming, etc., on some stuff, that it's actually doing is a multicast approach on it. And when we get to looking at addressing later in the next couple of chapters, these chapters are a little confusing to me where we get to what now, because they changed the order of stuff. So using each of those can be ways to make your network more efficient on which way, but your different protocols are going to use different ones of that. And when we go to set up sessions between machines, we're going to see sometimes they're doing a broadcast and sometimes a unicast approach on it. That when you first turn the machine on there, that when it went to get an address for that machine, because these machines don't have a built-in address assigned to them, it sent out a broadcast and said, I need an address. It couldn't send a unicast at that point because it doesn't know what the address of the server is that will give it an address. Does everybody follow on that? So it has to be a broadcast. Likewise, when the server sends back and says, here's an address you can use, it has to be a broadcast also, because that machine has no address at this point. So it has to just send it out to everybody. And then that machine hears it and goes and sees, here's the address that was offered to it. All of the other machines saw the message, and that they'll go, wait a minute, if they had the same address as that machine is offering out, they'll go, wait a minute, that's not going to work. I'm already using that address. And they actually do that, okay? Now, the machine that's sending out the address should not be sending out an address that it's already given to another machine. However, somebody could have gone ahead and used an address that's one that's actually supposed to be leased out and put into their machine as a permanent address. And that can goof up things within the network. And that's the reason they really are supposed to listen, the machine is supposed to listen on it and go, wait a minute, I'm using that address, you can't do that. Well, the machine that then got that address can send back a message to the server and say, yes, I'm taking that address. It'll send it as a unicast back at that point, because it knows the address of the server then, because it knows the address of what machine wrote it. So it sends back a unicast one, and then the server sends back a unicast and says, okay, so I'll let you use that address. Assuming no other machine wrote and said, whoa, that's not going to work. In which case it offers another address to it at that point. Again, through a broadcast, because there's no address assigned there yet. And then from that point on, unicast can happen because that machine now has an address sitting there. And so it's addressable. But they will send out broadcasts at different times where it's to let the other machines all know about they're on the network. And there's actually timed intervals that they send out those broadcasts to say, I'm still here. And some protocols do it a whole lot more than other protocols, which is the reason we won't use certain protocols we used to. So they then get back into protocols and talk some about that. And mention that with the protocol that they're going to be continuously seeing how messages are getting through. And remember where I said that some protocols require confirmation come back. If it doesn't get a confirmation in the due amount of time, either one, the other machine isn't working anymore, or that machine is working at that the stuff is taking too long to get there. It needs to slow down or decrease the size of the message. So the size of the messages that are allowed on the network will vary according to the traffic also. Because think about when we're out there on 151. There's a whole bunch of trucks on it. It gets a little bit harder to travel down the road, right? And that if we can pull the trucks off there, we can get more stuff traveling through at a little bit faster speed. And that if it's clear open road, we can let the bigger trucks on there and not impede traffic as much. Does that make sense? And so how much stuff can you carry at a time does make a difference out there. That if we get a fleet congestion, it'd be better to have a smaller message to go through it, that it can travel through it better. And if you try to drive through downtown Atlanta, they don't allow the big trucks to go through into downtown unless they're just coming to downtown. They can't be just passing through, to try to keep that all down on it. So then they talk about a couple of different protocols on it and about how they interact and that they're all going to be used. So they mention that if you're going to get a web page, which y'all were apparently doing earlier, that there's going to be several protocols involved on that. Just for the web page itself is going to usually use HTTP, or we'll see later also HTTPS, okay? Which is just the secure version of HTTP. HTTP is just the protocol that we use to transfer web pages, okay, for the interaction between the client, your machine, and the web server. TCP actually gets used behind that for the two machines to actually talk to each other. You were using HTTP to get your interaction in there of just the web page part, but for the two machines to talk to each other, they're actually using TCP behind there. IP actually keeps up with the addressing on the machines. And so for it to know the address of the other machine and know the addresses on there, it uses IP, Internet Protocol. And then the protocol it's actually using to send it across the network within the school to getting it out to go across the internet, it's using Ethernet to do that. And that you're using Ethernet to transfer it whether you're doing it wired or wireless. So you use a number of different protocols, and that's just keeping it simplistic right there. So they talk about protocol suites next. And a protocol suite is just a group of protocols. Those four we just mentioned, or actually three of the four, are all going to fall in the same suite. The HTTP, the TCP, and the IP are all going to fall in the TCP/IP protocol suite. You've got groups of protocols that work together, and they give you some list of them right there over on page 105. Which, if you're in the online curriculum, should correspond to 3.2.2.1, because that's where those numbers, when you're looking in a book, you see those 3-digit and 4-digit numbers. That's where it's matching it back to the book, to the online curriculum. TCP/IP is going to be the standard protocol suite that we're going to normally use today. Now, like what I told you is, if you go back to the 80s and really up into the early 90s, right there just before the internet, the World Wide Web came on and the internet really caught on as a commonality there, that you had lots of different protocol suites out there. So TCP/IP is going to be the one that's going to be the most common. However, there are others that are still out there. The ISO one that they mentioned there to you in the picture, you're really not going to see that one. I have never seen those mentioned anywhere, because actually, basically now TCP/IP fits into the ISO, but that's what ISO came up with originally, And that if you look and read on some of these, you'll see that they evolved into the other. TCP/IP was actually developed originally with the development of Unix. Not Linux, but Unix. So back to 1969 with the development of the internet. Okay? ISO is an international organization of standards. Yes, I know that's a different order than what the letters are, but that's what they agreed on when they created the organization. And it sets standards for all types of things, including some of these protocols we've got listed here under TCP/IP are actually ISO standardized also. You'll see ISO as a standard organization listed in other places out there in the world too. That you'll see sometimes, you'll see ISO mentioned of something being some type standard it complies to. A big one that you will see in the industry world is that ISO sets the standards for quality, and you'll see plants and stuff and some companies have flags or signs out at their place that says they're ISO 9000 certified. It's the same ISO. Does everybody follow on that? They've set rules of saying, here's the rules to say that how, in that case, of what is quality and are you actually doing things like you say you're going to do them, that you've got to set up for it.
Stand for? ISO? What does ISO stand for?
International Organization of Standardization.
All right.
Okay? Actually, when we get over a few more pages, when we get over to page 114, they're going to define it there, or 115, somewhere in there. Somewhere on there. I don't see it listed right there right at the moment, but it's in there because that's actually the big one. And so we'll come back to it right there. Because when we get to looking at our models, reference models, we're going to talk about ISO. Okay? And we're going to confuse you completely with the letters I, S, and O. Because they're going to come together in different ways, meaning different things. But but it's a group out there internationally, and I think they're based in Switzerland, if I remember right, France or Switzerland, that sets standards for everything. Within the United States, there's a group, a standardization organization that's run by the government that's called ANSI, A-N-S-I, American National Standards Institute. It sets the standards that we go by in the United States, and that you'll see that at times. They define, between those two organizations, they define for you of what is an ounce of gold, for instance. Because somebody's got a set of what is that specifically. Or what is an ounce or a pound. If nobody says exactly what it is, or how long is an inch, or whatever, that if there's nothing there that says on it, everybody can come up with their own rule on it. So if y'all all want to be 8 foot high, y'all could declare yourselves 8 foot high because of what you defined as a foot. And that was a problem before we had standardization, was that different people came up with different measurements of what something meant. So in this case, they have set and said, all right, if you're going to say this is a certain protocol, it's got to meet these certain rules so that somebody else also saying it's the same protocol, the two will be able to talk back and forth with each other. Does that make sense? So TCP/IP is there with its list of protocols. As far as where it's got these layer names, don't worry too much about that right now. When we get over there to page 116 or so, and to there where we get to the reference models, we'll see what these all fall there. They're actually, when they're doing the layers right there, they actually are using the TCP/IP layers. ISO's got a different set of layers, that they've got 7 layers instead of 4 layers. Apple Talk is the suite of protocols that who came up with? Apple. And that was how Apple set up their networking originally. You're not going to see much of Apple Talk anymore. But if you see a protocol that says talk in the name of it, it's probably an Apple protocol. And Apple came up with their own set of protocols for their machines to talk to each other, but that meant they didn't talk to machines that were using TCP/IP, for instance. Once Microsoft decided to go with networking, which was in the early 90s, that they chose to use the TCP/IP protocol because Unix was already using it, because that was what Unix was built around. And that's where the internet had gone to. And when Microsoft decided to go into networking, they went ahead and went with that. And that's where everything just settled down in TCP/IP. Novell NetWare, you probably won't ever hear of, although you may. Have any of you heard of Novell? Novell was the big networking software protocols of networking. They were the biggest one if you go back to the late 80s, early 90s, until the internet caught on big out there, that if you were going to do networking in your organization, you were probably using Novell from probably the late 80s, from 87 or so on up through about 95, that a lot of the networking in organizations, when you set up your network within your organization, you use Novell to do it. Now you're usually using a Windows networking to do it once Windows got to it. But before, you were adding a network on top of your operating system. Does that make sense? And Novell was the big one. They had the industry, but then they didn't convert over to the internet as things progressed along. However, Novell is still out there, but it's a small bit out there. It now uses, as opposed to what they've got listed down there, it now actually uses the TCP/IP protocol suite. There were other companies out there that developed networking operating systems also, and that were there, and there was a number of them there in the late 80s to the early 90s. But then with the development of the World Wide Web and the settlement on the TCP/IP protocol suite, that everything went to using the TCP, and that Windows went that direction. So now you're not needing to get a separate network operating system on. However, with Novell, y'all can encounter, and you may well have encountered Novell before and just didn't pay attention to it, is that a lot of public school systems still use Novell, except they're using the new versions of it, which is using TCP/IP with it, and they're running. But they're using Novell as the protocol, as the network operating system that runs their network. So if you go into the schools, a lot of times you will see that they're actually running off Novell. So you may have seen it before when you were in high school and such, that if you paid attention on your machine when they were coming up and connecting, that they were using Novell to do it. The school here is just using a Windows-based approach on it. So TCP/IP, it's an open standard. Novell was a closed standard. Apple was a closed standard. They didn't allow others to use their protocols into their products unless you paid them large amounts of money. Okay? Their stuff was similarity, but it was different. And so Their object was that they wanted just their devices to talk to their devices, and they had a control on it. TCP/IP has been open all along and available to everybody. Likewise, the ISO is going to be an open one, except you have to follow, it has to meet the minimum of what they define as the standard for it. Okay? And you think about it. For a vehicle to be driven on the highways out there are rules on what it has to meet certain qualifications. You have to have a windshield on it, for instance. Okay? And that it's got to meet other type rules to it that the government has set on it. So if it's a proprietary protocol, one company controls it, and that they control it completely and how it functions, and that you have to go through them to do it. I haven't seen that presentation that they reference right there on page 106 of the history of the Ethernet, but with the person that it's being presented by, it should be a good one, because he's actually, Bob Metcalf was instrumental in the development of Ethernet, and then into stuff developed into the internet. But AppleTalk and Novell NetWare, as they put it there, are legacy ones, that they are old ones that really aren't used now. Okay? There's others that were out there. One that I used pretty extensively there in the late 80s and early 90s was Lantastic, and then it let us connect to the other, but it had to do a conversion to get it out into TCP/IP. But it was a fairly simple one for me to set up, and where before Microsoft and Windows would let you just use within them, that you had to use another protocol on top of it. They mention here about the history on TCP/IP, and I'm going to give you that real briefly, and then we'll probably stop on it, because I really would rather talk about the TCP/IP protocol suite more Wednesday, and we've got this week and next week. So with TCP/IP, it really dates back to originally to the time that Unix was developed, although it was something done separate, but the two intermeshed some. TCP/IP is the original networking protocol suite that was the original network that was developed out there, okay, as a separate network type thing, other than just in a spot. In 1969, DARPANET was created, and actually it came off of AlohaNet, which was developed at that time, and DARPA got into it and developed it a step further. But DARPANET, or ARPANET, they've got this ARPANET here. You'll see it also sometimes as DARPANET instead of just ARPANET. Is that ARPA is Advanced Research Projects Agency. It is a part of the Department of Defense. That's why you'll see it as DARPA also as the Defense ARPA. It is still an agency that is out there today. It is where the federal government, the Defense Department in particular, all of the defense areas of the Army, Air Force, Navy, etc., that it is an agency within them that develops new technological type things. They developed TCP/IP there in '69 as a way to network together. It was actually the development of the internet, so that they're the ones that created the internet then, And TCP/IP was developed as the protocol suite for the internet. Now, the problem is, most organizations had no need for the internet until the World Wide Web really appeared. Colleges, universities, some research organizations, and DARPA were the ones that created the internet and DARPANet originally. So DARPANet really was the start of the internet. And they started from the bit of there that they just connected a few mainframe computers, it says in 4 locations together, and then they expanded on that. So in '69 they were just connecting 4 mainframe computers at scattered locations to communicate with each other. There was no web pages on it. That didn't come about till 1993. There was no DNS that we heard him talking about just a moment ago, appeared to be our problem in here right now, which is your ability to put in a domain name and it converts it to an IP address, to that number address. Okay? That, none of that was there. You had to do everything using the IP addresses, which was those 4 dotted numbers, okay? That was created by the U.S. Department of Defense and them, and the universities and research labs. And that was large universities that were involved in it. So, Department of Defense had their whole objective in developing DARPANet/internet was to get all of the bases and everything all connected together with lots of different redundant connections. If you remember, I think I mentioned to y'all last week. So that if something happened to one location or to one link, everybody still stayed in communication. That was a big part that the Defense Department's emphasis was, and for that communication to occur there. Colleges, the universities, and the research labs, their bid on it was a way to be able to share research between different universities and other research places. The libraries were ones that were quick to jump onto the internet of using it also, back to sharing that research. When I was in college and then when I was working on finishing my doctorate and writing my dissertation, in both cases, there were some times of me trying to find some articles that college I was at didn't have but I needed, and that by using their internet connection I was able to go and look at the article at another place. Now, it was not like you would look at it today in a nice printed up page or whatever. It was where I was finding it in a plain text setup. So it wasn't the friendliest thing. And then you had to know what the IP address was for that library to get into it, and then you could do a search in there. And not through a GUI, but it was all text-based. So TCP/IP was developed as part of developing ARPANET/internet to allow those machines to talk to each other. They had to set up protocols that they were each going to use, and they created TCP/IP as a result of it. And that's where we're still using today, although it's been expanded and a lot more added to it over time. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of protocols within TCP/IP. Now, y'all aren't going to learn hundreds or thousands of them. We're only going to learn a few of them. And that's what they do on page 107 and 108. Go through a number, and I'm going to tell you a couple of those you probably don't have to worry about anymore, but a lot of those are still definitely being used in existence. DNS is one of them that's listed down there, somewhere on the pages. Actually, it's the first one. So we're going to talk about how the protocols as they set them up. Now, the other companies that were setting up their networks that they sold out there into the public and for you to network your computers in your organization, because if you go back to the very early 80s when the PCs first came out, it was all standalone PCs. There was no connectivity, and you got a PC that just worked by itself. Okay? And then we wanted to start sharing information, so we needed to network them together. For a while there in the 80s, that you actually had networking done by SneakerNet, which is where you, at that time period, you'd put it onto a diskette and then take it to the other machine and plug it in that other machine. So it was carried from one place to another. You still do a certain degree of SneakerNet today. Because if you've got a file on your machine at home that he wants also, what's one of the ways to get that information to him? You could send it across the network.
USB.
Huh?
USB is a good one.
You could put it onto your USB drive and take it, bring it to school and let him have that to then take home with him, or copy it over onto his USB drive in the machine here, right? At that point, you're doing SneakerNet because you just carried it physically from one machine to the other machine. Okay? So SneakerNet's still there. You're still doing SneakerNet some, because y'all don't all share. We don't all share files always via the network, although we do extensively do that now. But sometimes we still actually put them on our USB drive and carry them from one place to the other. Okay? When I'm running the computer video system there at church on Sunday morning, and I developed the stuff that I put up there, that I put the presentation together at home. I don't generally now, but for the longest time, initially when I did it, I would put it on my USB drive, take it and then plug it in when I got there and copy it onto the machine there and run it. Now I'm using Dropbox to do it, and that I'll upload it to Dropbox and download it from there. But if I'm suspicious that the network connection may not be working at church, or I've been told it's not working, or something else happens, I'll still put it on the USB drive and take it there in my pocket. Although I don't do that very often now, but once in a while I still do. And that's a backup ways on it. And that sometimes, and that's, I have had the case of I got there and that the network connection wasn't working there at the church up there for me where I am at, and that I had to drive back home, put it on the USB drive, and then drive back to church and then go do it. And at that point be in a hurry because I don't have a whole lot of time before the service starts. Luckily I tend to go an hour early on it to make sure everything's set up right. Because microphones are never in the right place in the sanctuary or whatever. And that you got to make sure they're all there, turned on correctly, etc. And so I just allow an hour in it. All right, so does everybody got the idea of what TCP/IP is now? Now I haven't told you what it stands for, but it's Transfer Control Protocol, Internet Protocol. It's two, TCP and IP are two of the predominant protocols in the suite. And initially they were the big ones. Now they're two of many, and that we're going to actually see that sometimes when you're using TCP/IP suite, you never even use TCP or IP, because we're going to see there's an offsetting one for both of them.
So is this one of the both different? It says Transmission Control Protocol, TCP. So are those, is this just a different one? Because it says Transmission Control Protocol for this TCP.
It's Transmission Control Protocol, or transmission I think is actually right. I said transfer.
All right.
Okay. Transmission's probably, but if you do transfer or transmission, if you got a question on it, you get it right. You know, you're not going to have that as a difference. You're not going to have those two names mixed in there on you.
All right.
But transmission's what it should be. So it's the predominant suite out there, but it's not the only suite that's necessarily out there still, because you'll actually still find sometimes if somebody's using some older Apple computers, that they may still be using some of those Apple protocols off of that older Apple computer, connecting into a network with some other Apple machines that are using TCP/IP. So you can mix them some too. And then, like I say, you'll see Novell actually out there, but now it's really not going to use those protocols they got listed there anymore. It's going to use the TCP/IP protocols now, but still use their management system is what you're buying in that case, is that you're using their management system to manage your network instead of using Windows management system to it and getting a Windows server or whatever, that you're using what Novell supplies instead. But Novell was a big booming and represented probably close to 90% of all networking there in the late 80s, early 90s. And now, as an also name.
What initiated the change for that?
Hmm?
What initiated the change for that?
Because Novell didn't change to the standardization that the rest of the world went to. That they, instead of switching over to TCP/IP, tried to stay with theirs and said you ought to use theirs, that theirs ran a whole lot better. And people went to switching to the other way. So Microsoft had a big degree of control on that because Microsoft chose to go using TCP/IP. The other part was the World Wide Web was created and everybody wanted onto the internet. Because initially you didn't have that there. AOL, which is still a fragment of it, still sitting out there. Verizon now owns it, along with Yahoo. The AOL was another one that was out there to give you those web page type things before web pages existed. But then they didn't switch over rapidly into the internet and web page, and that killed them off. But they were a way to, they had their own internet there, and that they did their own web pages, and that they were the big one, and then they were the connection to be able, they were first one to allow you to be able to dial in and hook into. And they still have several 100,000 people using dial-in through AOL today, surprisingly. I saw a statistic not long ago that said they still had several 100,000 people paying for dial-up connection with AOL, of paying them $10 a month. In the past, in the early 90s, they represent that they had millions of people paying $40 and $50 a month for connection to their network. All right, questions on all of that? Then not tomorrow, but Wednesday, we'll get into talking about the individual protocols, and then we'll get into talking about the actual protocol models. Probably more of going to the models next week, and that will spend Monday and Wednesday next week on the models of TCP/IP and the OSI model. And the OSI model is actually developed and is part of ISO, which we just talked about earlier today. Which is where I told you we're going to mix up the I's, S's, and O's. Questions?